Good morning and welcome again to House Church. Before I get started with the lesson today, I'd like to give one last big plug for our Men's Day event. There is a QR code on the screen here, and if you need to, feel free to pause the video and let the men scan this code, and it will take them to the website where the registration button is. I know I've talked about this a lot. And I know I've said it before, but this is such a great opportunity for the men in our church to be engaged and challenged by the Word of God. As Aaron Richardson so eloquently said last week at church, this world and the church are both waiting for godly men to rise up and make an impact in a broken society, to show people a picture of a godly community of men who really believe something deeply. This Men's Day event is going to be the first of many to come. And honestly, I think they're needed. It is such a great opportunity to have some fun together, get into God's Word together, and let it inspire us to change and grow. Now, I know it costs a bit, but it'll be worth it. If you find yourself, though, needing a little help financially to make it happen, please contact me and let me know. Okay, there are a couple of brothers out there who have volunteered to help pay and get people registered. So if that's you, please contact me. I just don't want anything to hold you or your boys back from coming to this, okay? All right, let's get into the lesson today. Today, I'm introducing a new fall series on the Beatitudes called The Smile of God. It's probably the most famous portion of the Sermon on the Mount, which can be read in Matthew 5 through 7. And this series was actually Lorianne's idea, and I think it's a great idea. As I've studied through it lately, it has been so rich and inspiring, and we as a staff know you will all grow from it. So let's start by reading Matthew 5, 1 through 12 together. It says this: Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Okay, there's just so much in here, right? The Sermon on the Mount is so powerful that we can hardly overstate its influence on mankind. St. Augustine described it as the perfect standard of the Christian life. There's a guy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was the famous German pastor and theologian who led Christians in a resistance and opposition to the Nazi dictatorship. And he wrote a classic book called The Cost of Discipleship. Great book. But that book was based on the Sermon on the Mount. Years ago, I read a little classic book written in the 1500s by a spiritual monk named Thomas à Kempis. It was called The Imitation of Christ. Great little book. But it was based on his idea of putting Jesus' words here from the Sermon on the Mount into practice in a countercultural way. It's influenced a lot of people who consider Christianity important. But you know, the Sermon on the Mount has even influenced people outside of the Christian faith. Like, for instance, did you know it had a huge influence on Gandhi's political approach to nonviolence resistance? So like it or not, the Sermon on the Mount has had a greater influence on humanity than any other sermon ever preached. Why is that? Well, I think there are two main reasons. First, the Sermon on the Mount came straight from the lips of Jesus himself. I found it interesting that some scholars believe that what we have here in Matthew 5 through 7 might just be a distillation of his teaching, and that the original Sermon on the Mount could possibly have been like several hours long. I think it's safe to say that Jesus is the only person that can preach a sermon that keeps his audience captivated for several hours. If Ron or I preached a sermon at the West Shore that lasted several hours, we'd probably be looking for another job, right? I don't even think Jeff could get away with that. But seriously, as we know, Jesus was God in the flesh. The Bible in Isaiah says he was Emmanuel, God with us. So we have a sermon about life straight from God, delivered in person by God. That's pretty awesome. The creator of the universe communicating his preferred way of life directly to us. Second, the Sermon on the Mount strikes directly to the heart of how we live in this world. It is so extremely countercultural that there's literally no way a man could have described this as a way to flourish as a human today. There's just no way. I mean, think about it. It's blessed to be persecuted. Seriously? Being persecuted is painful. It means you're victimized and picked on and harmed. And sometimes just because of your beliefs. That's rough. It's blessed to mourn. Mourning naturally suggests that we're experiencing deep trauma or disappointment, that we're a state of hurt. It's blessed to be merciful. I mean, think about it. Extending mercy to those who are trying to harm us goes against every impulse we have about revenge, bitterness, and just pulling away from people like that and protecting ourselves. The poor in spirit are the ones who will inherit the kingdom of God. Poor in spirit suggests weakness and need, something that honestly today is totally scoffed at. I mean, I could keep going, but I think you get the point. Jesus takes every aspect of how we think a flourishing life should be lived, and he turns it completely upside down. Still, when we read it and study it, it's hard for us to grasp. It seems inspiring to us, but not necessarily accessible or doable for us. The question is, why? Well, in my opinion, there's many reasons, but in my opinion, it has to do with a deep and flawed understanding of what it means to be blessed. What does blessed mean today to most people? It means happy. It essentially means that life has shown favor to you and things are feeling good. Now, I know there are some translations that have actually translated it as happy. They're not totally accurate, and I think those are doing people no favors today, especially those of us who live in the Western world. To see blessed as happy simply reinforces our modern and distorted notions of what a successful life looks like. It can also lead to deep disappointment and delusionment. You know, years ago we were selling our house in Tacoma, and we were having a hard time. It sat on the market for a while, which made me frustrated because the market was scorching hot in the Seattle area. Friends were listing their houses and selling it within hours. I mean, they were selling it for hundreds of thousands of dollars over in like 3 hours. And then they'd post about it online and say, wow, God really blessed us. My obvious feeling was, he must not be blessing me. I remember as a young Christian going to church and sitting through Good News Sharing. You guys know what I'm talking about, right? Good News Sharing. Someone would share inevitably about a friend getting baptized and say, God really has blessed me and my efforts. Problem is, others of us were sincerely trying to share our faith and not feeling very successful. So was God blessing them and punishing us? Good question. More seriously, I remember a woman in Seattle who was having a very difficult time having children. When someone shared how much of a blessing it was to have a child, she felt like God didn't favor her. It was tough for her. She went through a period of feeling like she was being punished and certainly not blessed. So the question is, should we feel blessed when we sell our home, convert a friend, or have a beautiful child? Of course we should. But what I'm suggesting is that success and happiness is the main and primary way we think of blessing. And that's not only flawed, but it's dangerously distorting. I remember having Jesse and Mufid Tomei. They lead the Middle East. I remember having them into Seattle to preach and get with our staff. and we were sitting around asking them questions about how to be fruitful in our church. And one person said, how are you fruitful in your church? And what are you praying for? How are you helping people become Christians? And I'll never forget what Jessie said. She says, to be honest, we're praying for more persecution and suffering because that seems to be when the church is most fruitful. And of course, we looked around and said, wait, what? That's powerful. But think about it. That is a more biblical way of thinking than how we think of being fruitful, isn't it? By saying blessed here in the Beatitudes, Jesus is not declaring how people feel. He's making a statement about what God feels about their way of living. Blessed is God looking at us and approving of us, approving of the way we live, especially since it goes against the grain of popular thinking. It is God approving of the idea that we trust way more in His way of living than the way the world thinks we should live. It is Him expressing approval that we voluntarily choose to live as a human in the way that He thinks works best, in the way He believes will impact this world, in the way He thinks will get people to really ponder the deep spiritual things of life. The word blessed here literally means divine favor. That's powerful. To think that God sees you when others don't, notices you when others overlook it, that's worth talking about, isn't it? It's a way of thinking that the popular author Max Lucado says brings the applause of heaven. Or as one commentator I read says, elicits the smile of God. And I like that. You know, Carla and I raised 3 kids in the church, and at times, when we would see them trying their very best to be people of character in a tough way, in a tough and broken world, I remember it would make me proud, and I would sometimes watch them and just smile. I remember, for instance, I don't want to embarrass Zach all the time, but I remember playing in the state championship several years ago, and Zach didn't play well in the final round, and he didn't win. And there was another guy that won. And this guy, quite frankly, was kind of an annoying personality. He was cocky. And after the state championship was over, he was celebrating, and Zach just looked at me and said, let's go, let's get out of here. And I said, Zach, we will, but you need to go over there and shake his hand and congratulate him. And I watched Zach walk over there. It was like the walk of death. Walked over there, shook his hand and said, congratulations. And it just made me smile because that doesn't come naturally to us. When we live according to God's values and resist all of our human impulses, and when we let that define success, He looks at us and approves. I think He smiles. And that gives me so much comfort and security. So here's what I'd like all of us to think about, okay? Whose approval are you seeking? Now, before you say, well, only God's approval, seriously, think about it. We all want to be approved of. We all want to feel like we are living a life of tremendous worth. We all want people to be proud of us. We all want to be validated. And when we were created, we were meant to find that only in God. But then Satan came along, lied to us, made us get that twisted. Then when sin entered the world, our need to find meaning didn't disappear. It just got transferred to created things, temporary things like wealth, career, or the praise of people, which is so fleeting, right? And you all know we live in a digital age. I mean, you know your kids are growing up in a digital age. So this is important to think about. A digital age has so much potential for good. However, we even transferred our need for approval to things like social media. Here is a true fact. 10, 15 years now after social media arrived, counselors and therapists now almost universally agree that like addiction is very real. We post something, and since we seek others' approval, we keep checking back to see if people have liked it, and then we want to see who liked it. You know, we were having a conversation at staff about this last week, and Lance Daniel said something that really caught my attention. He said he read where a psychologist said getting liked on social media is as powerful to some people as a hit of meth. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. And I think it's really messing us up. For too many of us, realizing that God likes us is not as powerful as what other people think about us. And we need to really think about that and work on that. Look, like everything else, that he does. Satan wants to bring approval and praise down to our level. But seeking approval of things and people here requires constant maintenance and eventually leaves us exhausted. It's like you're chasing your tail. Maintaining a state or a feeling of happiness is chasing subjective feelings, and it'll eventually just leave us empty. It's not the way to a blessed, content, and flourishing life. And it's not the way to a life that transcends the realities of this world. That is accomplished by living according to God's view of being human, no matter what it costs. When we do that, it resonates with our soul and with our deepest purpose and our longings. It allows us to be okay when we're persecuted, to love the people that hate us, to see mourning as a way of experiencing what God experiences. It changes everything. The real question is, do we desire the smile of God more than anything else? Recently, someone I really respect asked me, Darren, how do you define success as a Christian and a minister? Such a great question. It caught me off guard because instantly I thought of all kinds of worldly measures of success or subjective feelings. And then he said to me, here's what success looks like, okay? God sees you, he looks at you, and he says, well done, my good and faithful servant. It was that comforting verse in Matthew 25:23. It's not about reaching subjective markers of success or happiness, but it's simply about being faithful to God's way of living in this crazy world. And despite what anybody says about me, or however anybody feels about me, is that enough for me? That was such a good question for me. So I pray that as we study the Beatitudes, we don't compare ourselves to each other. We're going to read some really good, inspiring, and challenging stuff. But I pray that we don't keep striving to maintain a worldly sense of happiness, but we see it as a call to a more meaningful and spiritual life, okay? Here's the really cool thing about the Beatitudes. The first 4 Beatitudes focused on our relationship with God, and the second 4 focus on our relationship with our fellow men. So in that way, they cover all of life, and I can't think of anything more relevant. I look forward to talking about how they can impact our lives in church and take us deeper. So that's all for today. So here are a couple questions to consider for discussion in your house churches, okay? First, how do you naturally define the idea of being blessed? Is there something that needs to change there? Are you seeing it correctly? Talk about that. Really get open about that. And then second, what would our community of faith, what would our church be like if we all sought to live according to these spiritual values instead of being drawn to valuing what the world says we should value? What would our faith community look like? How could we be a greater light? Have a good discussion about that. I hope this has helped you all. Have a great day. God bless you.